But yeah, so cultural self-awareness, right? That is where we need to begin in order to think through who am I culturally, right? And how does that show up in the work that I do in the classroom? And so, of course, the next step would be cultural synchronicity in terms of thinking about how does your culture sync up with your students. Cultural synchronicity is this concept that was developed by Jacqueline Jordan Irvine, which is who's pictured right there. And so essentially, what she's saying is that synchronicity, cultural synchronicity is kind of like this shared cultural values and practices that can be shared between educators and students. And so I really appreciate this concept because it's not something that I see people talking about a lot. Like in terms of cultural responsive learning and stuff, like it's often kind of positioned like, how can we bridge the gap between the teacher and the student? And it's like, well, sometimes the gap isn't really that large. Like, y'all probably have heard in these various diversity meetings and stuff that we've had along our professional lives, of like the mirror or the window, right? In terms of representation, a mirror is a person in a child's life who can serve as kind of like you reflect back aspects of their story, you reflect back aspects of their identity, right? So they can see you as a role model because you have this shared synchronicity with that student, right? But we also can think about ourselves as serving as windows, right? How can you be a bridge to share with students different stories and to share with them and expose them to different people who they do share identities with, or who aspects of their story align more with your students, right? And so the example that I just gave you is a perfect example of that, is that I had to learn how to be more of a window for my students who I didn't have as much shared cultural synchronicity with, right? And it takes a lot of intentionality, and also takes getting to know students, right? Because if you don't know what aspects of their identities they're bringing into the classroom, then you won't know what you aren't addressing, right? So one thing I did mention to you guys is that where I'm from poem is one of two kind of get to know you activities that I would do at the start of every school year. The other one was a surprisingly powerful activity where I essentially would have students research the etymology of their names. And it kind of teaches them also like research skills. But then also they had to interview folks within their families or someone who might know why they were named what they were named. And so you end up tapping into all these different types of like family stories about, well, this, friend did this for me. And so I always told her that I was going to name one of my kids after her, or, your name is a mixture of these two people's names. And so it really was like this roundabout way of students sharing a lot more about themselves with me. And these are different details that I was able to use over the course of the year in terms of thinking about like what are their interests in, what are the different cultural values and gifts that my students are bringing into the classroom. And so after we've done our own cultural self-exploration, right, we have to think about like how do our cultural selves, like how do they relate to our students? How are we in sync with them? How are we not in sync with them? And how does that play into how we might engage in cultural responsive learning in general and social emotional learning?